Good morning, IB juniors, or good night, afternoon, whatever time of the day it is. The objective of today's lesson is to evaluate the causes and effects of the Treaty of Versailles. To give you some background information about where we left off last week in class, Germany had just signed an armistice. An armistice is the precursor to a treaty. It stops the violence of war. It stops the fighting for a brief period of time. A reminder, the reasons why Germany was collapsing and losing the war, or why many felt they were losing the war, was, for number one, the U.S. entry into the war. A war of attrition was what World War I was. A war of attrition can be defined as a war to see who'd kill the most people. Germany was actually doing a good job killing a lot of the military forces given by Triple Entente. But once the Triple Entente basically got help, or once the U.S. joined the war, it did give the Triple Entente more numbers. Number two was the German blockade. Reminder that Great Britain basically controlled the seas, they had a stronger navy than Germany did, and the blockade basically caused a lot of problems in the home front. People at home front of Germany were not able to get the proper amount of resources. So as you're looking at this lecture, ask yourself two questions. Number one, is it ever possible to have world peace? The video clip that I showed in class focuses on some of the current events and the wars that our country has been in with the last 10 years. And ask yourself, what can be done to promote world peace today? Is it ever possible? Wilson's 14 points. As we talked in class, Woodrow Wilson, he was the war president. He was the president of the United States during World War I. And on January of 1918, he basically gave a speech to Congress addressing 14 points in which he feel would promote peace in Europe and throughout the whole world. Some of these things that they addressed was, number one, no more secret agreements. Number two, free navigation of all seas. But more important, an establishment of a League of Nations. In this league, countries would basically practice diplomacy rather than warfare. They would talk about the issues concerning issues and conflicts regarding each country, and it would guarantee political and territorial independence of all states. What you guys did for me in class today was you went through all of those 14 points, and you, number one, basically explained whether or not you believed it would promote peace, and number two, whether or not you believed that, or you develop an argument whether or not you believed if each point was actually attainable. Okay. Any questions? Make sure you ask me in class after viewing this.
One song only.
So, everyone heads to Paris. Jay-Z, Kanye, prime ministers of France, Great Britain, United States. Actually, if you look at this picture right here, to the far right, you obviously have President Woodrow Wilson. Unfortunately, his 14 points were criticized not only by people in the United States, but they were also criticized by the French and Great Britain as, number one, not being realistic, but also being too lenient on the Germans. In the middle, you have the Prime Minister of France, Prime Minister Clemenceau. And the Prime Minister Clemenceau, as you can see in that picture, was an older man. And he basically believed that the Germans should be punished. He was alive in the time of the Franco-Prussian War, in which the German nation was successful against the French and obtaining the land of the Alsace-Lorraine. What the French Prime Minister believed was that, number one, economically, the Germans should be the ones that accept responsibility of the war and therefore shall pay for the war. At the same time, he also believed that the Germans' military should also be decreased to no more than 100,000 people. He really wanted to make sure that they were weak and they would never come back again and promote violence in Europe. To the far left, you have, from Great Britain, Prime Minister Lloyd George. And what the Prime Minister of Great Britain believed was that the Germans should be held responsible for the war, but at the same time, they should be punished only to a certain extent. The purpose of the treaty was not necessarily to embarrass Germany, but to make sure that they accept responsibility for the war and to economically take responsibility for what they can. They were a little bit more lenient than the French were, but by far not as lenient as the United States. In this Treaty of Versailles, something that you want to understand is that number one, these three countries, Great Britain, United States, and the French, were the ones that basically put up the treaty. They were the ones that constructed the treaty. Russia did not take part in the treaty simply because some people saw them as traitors. They signed the earlier treaty with Germany that basically showed that they surrendered. On the other hand, Germany and the other Triple Alliance powers were not allowed to negotiate in this deal. This treaty was basically constructed by the Triple Entente, and Germany had to sign it or go back to war. There was no negotiation involved. So what you guys did for me in class today is you were all assigned a different prime minister or president. You would assign a different country, and you were to tell me, what would you do for the treaty? Would you be lenient, or would you be someone that was very strict on Germany based on what country you represented? More money, more problems. That's exactly what happened in terms of the economic effects of the Treaty of Versailles. Why it's called the Treaty of Versailles, first off, is, as I stated before, it was actually signed in Paris, but it took place at the Palace of Versailles made by King Louis XVI. Well, what was the price of the war? Well, first off, between 9.4 and 11 million people died as a result of World War I. So with this in mind, all countries felt that someone needed to take responsibility for the war. In this case, the Guilt of the War Clause stated that Germany must accept full responsibility for the war. Think about this. If you have a brother and sister, and let's say you and your brother and sister all caused some problems or trouble in the house, in my case when I was little, what I would do was I would just beat them both up, and they would fight back and hurt me as well. Now, obviously, mom, dad would get mad simply because the kids are being annoying. And what they do is they typically blame the oldest person. And the oldest kid then becomes angry. Well, that's how Germany felt. They felt that it's not fair that we're accepting full responsibility for the war, as they also had alliances with other countries. And also they felt that the Triple Entente may have been responsible for it as well. Another thing you want to look at is the 15 square kilometers damaged in France. More than 17 million people, or $17 million in damages to buildings, and $29.6 million damage worldwide. Well, here's what you understand. Because Germany had accepted full responsibility for the war, Germany would have to pay the equivalent of 226 billion American dollars today. They could pay this in either installments or also in money and goods. Here's what you want to understand, though. This is evident that that amount was too much. In 1924, the Triple Entente basically signed what was called the Dawes Act. And what this act did was it lowered the amount that the Germans owed. It was actually originally 260 something billion, and they lowered it to 226 billion. And then 1928, they passed a Young Plan. They lowered that amount significantly by a few billion, and at the same time allowed Germany to pay it in installments. Some considerations to look at, though, is number one, Germany's economy was already drained from the war itself. Okay, they had expended a lot of their natural resources and a lot of their money on the weapons used for the war. Number two, their population was already drained. A reminder, they basically used conscription. They sent almost all of their men, ages 17 and up, to the war. With that in mind, they could not produce the goods and the money that they wanted to. And last but not least, due to the Treaty of Versailles, many of Germany's colonies were taken away. Due to the fact that their colonies were taken away, they couldn't produce the natural goods that they had simply because they didn't have the resources to. Just to clearly redefine what war reparations are basically payments that a country needs to make because of the destruction that they assumed responsibility for. If you look at that blue link that I attached to the PowerPoint, what that blue link basically shows is a video clip and also an article about how Germany was only able to pay for the total $226 billion reparations as of the year 2010. What a lot of countries have now done when signing treaties of war is they make sure that the reparations are realistic. Simply because if the number is too high of amount, economically the country is going to continue to suffer, but also it's just not going to be paid. And I believe what a lot of countries have now done, it's 30%. That if a country is paying for all the damages caused of the war, it's usually 30% of the country's GDP. The military restrictions of Germany, it was another part of the Treaty of Versailles. The French wanted to make sure that Germany would reduce its land army. Reminder that during World War I, Germany basically conducted conscription and a draft that made sure that all men over the age of 16 would participate in the war. While what the Treaty of Versailles did was it only limited the German military personnel to 100,000. It could not exceed that amount. Therefore, Germany was never allowed to conduct a draft. Furthermore, another thing that happened as a result of the treaty was that the Air Force and also naval fleet was very limited. In fact, the Air Force, Germany wasn't even allowed to have one at all. You want to be reminded that prior to World War I, Germany engaged in militarism and an arms race with Great Britain to see who could build the strongest navy. Well, Germany was no longer able to expand off that military. And furthermore, it really hurt them to see that while they were demobilizing and decreasing their arms, their enemies, such as Great Britain and France, continue to build on theirs. More importantly, the Rhineland. The Rhineland was a piece of German land. It was a piece of German territory. And what the Allies did was for the next 15 years, they occupied this. What I mean by that is France, Great Britain, and the United States would set up military bases there, and they would monitor the progress of Germany's military restrictions. They wanted to make sure that they were complying and following all the rules. This really hurt Germany's ego, and at the same time, these restrictions were no longer followed by the time Adolf Hitler came into power. The territorial effects of the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things that the Triple Entente decided to do was create an independent Polish state. What I mean by this was prior to World War I, the Poles were scattered and they wanted to establish a home. Well, what the Triple Entente decided to do was take away German land. They took away West Prussia and the territory of Posen, which were all part of Germany, and they gave it to Poland. This was now established as Poland, where the Poles could settle and make their home. Another thing was the Alsace-Lorraine. Quick review. Remember, in the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germans defeated the French, they took that French land called Alsace-Lorraine. Not only did they invade many of the French museums and took away some of the famous pieces of art, but they took away this land that came with it. Well, after the Treaty of Versailles, that land was made sure by the French to be given back to them. Danzig, which was a city in Germany, also now became an international city, which means it was no longer in the form of German custody. What you want to understand here is Germany lost more than 1 million square miles. It had to give up all of its colonies in Asia and Africa, and it also lost a lot of the territories that it had prior to World War I. Natural territory, what I mean by that. What you also want to understand too was not only did Germany lose territory, but what we'll discuss in a later lecture is Austria and Hungary became split, and furthermore, they lost territory as well. If you notice the map of Europe after 1919, first and foremost, not only do you see that Poland is now on the map and the amount of German territory is reduced, but also that Austria and Hungary, they were once one empire, now they're split. The land from the Austrian Hungarians have now been split up into different countries that were formed, such as Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania. This is very important simply because people that were Austrian and Hungarian were now forced to obtain citizenship in those newly formed countries. Bulgaria also lost some of its territory as they fought side by side by Austria-Hungary and Germany. What you want to notice overall as a result of Treaty of Versailles is it did have long-lasting effects on the economy of Germany. Germany would not be able to pay for those reparations. It lost its colonies, it lost a sense of pride, and therefore caused a depression in the country. What you also want to understand is the military. A lot of times when people believe that a strong military brought a strong sense of pride, Germany was really limited by that. If you have any questions, please make sure that you guys email me or ask me in class. This is all the stuff we went over this week. Just make sure, though, just looking at this lecture is not enough information. You got to make sure that you do the readings and homework provided with this as well. All right, shoot me an email.